World War II. So we're going to see that after America joins the war, Japan's forces and conquests are basically going to reach their limit after about 6 months. The problem is we can say that now looking at the war back retrospectively, but we didn't know that then. And on top of that, we're going to see that in Europe, the Allied fortunes are going from bad to even worse. But no one knew that basically the Axis powers were actually going to peak mid-year. And so we're going to start seeing decisive turning points in about November of 1942. Quick note, I wanted to remind everyone, so the Axis powers predominantly are Japan, Germany, and Italy, whereas the Allied powers are predominantly the United States, Great Britain, France, though keep in mind France has been overwhelmed at this point, the Soviet Union, and China. When it comes to stopping Germany, this is truly a global war. You're actually going to see 6 different fronts during this war. And so we have this world map here so you can kind of follow along with these different fronts. So you have in northern Africa fighting going along, especially like the Suez Canal. Then you have on the Eastern Front, that would be like the Soviet Union versus the German lines. And then you have in the North Atlantic, German submarines predominantly against United States Navy, but mostly against Great Britain's Navy. Then you have China, where Japan basically couldn't crush the resistance there. And then you have all of like Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, Malaya, Burma, things like that. And then you have your Central Pacific, where it's the Japanese fleet versus the United States Navy. Keep in mind, though, as per what the United States had discussed with Great Britain, they are going to try to defeat Germany before Japan, really. The reason for this was basically we have a Eurocentric view on history in general, but also because Germany's industrial capacity and their technological expertise combined with their huge armies just meant that they were actually stronger than Japan. And so if Germany was defeated, this automatically would mean that eventually Japan would follow. I say eventually. But if Japan was defeated, that didn't necessarily mean that Germany would be defeated. The Eastern Front, though, is really going to be the key to the Allied hopes. Germany by 1941 has much of the Soviet Union's resources, and so then they start targeting southern Russia. The thing is, this is easier said than done. So at first, the Germans are going to open up with success, but basically each day they go into Soviet Union territory further and further and further, this is going to stretch out their supply lines and leach their supplies. So they're going to actually start literally running out of fuel and spare parts. You get like horses dying along the way from lack of food. And then this all brings us to the turning point that comes at Stalingrad that is marked on this map. Stalingrad was the industrial center on the western bank of the Volga River. And to take this city basically became this test of will that outweighs any kind of substantial military importance. So what initially happened was Germans with others took the city. But then we get the Red Army, so the Soviet Union's coming in with a counterstrike on November 18th. And basically what they would do is cut off about 290,000 Axis soldiers in the city. Now, at first, airlifts are going to be able to help out the Axis soldiers and let them keep up the fighting. But eventually, the Germans will have to surrender in 1943. This is really the first mass capitulation on the German side, and it's really going to show the immense human cost on both sides. The Soviet army in the Battle of Stalingrad suffers more deaths in this one battle than the United States suffers in the entire war. And we're going to talk about the numbers later. Literally, they called the fields of Stalingrad the so-called, in quotes, white fields, because of all the human bones that showed up after the spring thaw. Simultaneously, while this was going on, the Soviet Union also dismantled nearly 3,000 factories and basically moved them further into the interior of the Soviet Union and rebuilt them just east of the German advances. And this was in the middle of a Siberian winter, by the way. And so a lot of the Soviet Union citizens are also going to follow these factories and then go to work in them. And so by the time you get to Stalingrad, the Soviet Union is producing 4 times as many tanks and warplanes as the Germans. So they're being able to outproduce the Germans on some level. And then we have Great Britain. Just like back in World War I, Germany is going to try to isolate Great Britain. And so we have this so-called Battle of the Atlantic that you can see just like one map here of. The British, though, are going to fight back, and they're also going to plan really well and be able to ration their supplies, so much so that Great Britain actually cuts their need for imports in half during the war. They also would organize like protected convoys and harden the targets, basically making it even more difficult to find their ships in the wide ocean. Because that was the real issue. German submarines, or U-boats as they were called, dominated the Atlantic in 1942. But this balance shifts basically when Allied aircraft began to be able to track submarines with radar. So we're seeing technological advances meet the challenge of U-boats or submarines. And so in this way, Allied aircraft would spot submarines as they came to the surface and then attack them with depth charges. And in fact, by 1943, the United States is launching ships faster than the Germans could sink them. We're also going to see the British are really involved in ground fighting in North Africa, and there they're going to be able to repel German and Italian forces. When it comes to the Pacific, reports in Eastern Asia really were appalling early on in the war, and even early on when America first joins in. The thing is, the Japanese are going to attack the Philippines. They're going to destroy most of the United States air power there, as well as the ground power. And what they didn't destroy would be very much isolated. We see the Japanese take British Singapore, they push the British out of Burma, they overwhelmed Filipino and United States positions in the Bataan Peninsula, and they take a lot of prisoners of war, although these prisoners of war a lot of times would die of maltreatment, especially on the way to prisoner of war camps. This is actually known as the Bataan Death March and everything. We're seeing actually the last American bastion of Coringa in Manila Bay would end up surrendering as well. So the Allied fortunes are not doing well, but this is going to be reversed, or really the first check against Japanese expansion will come with the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. So the Battle of Coral Sea on May 7th and 8th of 1942, what we basically see is United States aircraft carriers are going to halt the Japanese expansion. Technically, if you look at Coral Sea, it's a tactical victory for the Japanese because they actually sunk more ships than the American side did, but it's a strategic victory for the Allies because basically the Allies are going to destroy enough ships on the Japanese side that it's going to be harder for the Japanese to be a threat in the future. That's a lot of it. Is the American side and the Allied side is going to have more ships in general, and so they can lose more and still wage war effectively, whereas the Japanese can't. And that's actually what brings us to Midway, where we do see the United States managing to defeat Japanese forces. It was really interesting too because the Japanese tried to lure the Americans into an attack, a surprise attack, but the United States is going to hack these codes and basically refuse the bait and be able to kind of set their own traps. In the end, we're going to see United States Navy dive bombers are going to find the Japanese fleet just faster, and so there's a little luck involved here. And basically, they're going to cripple 3 aircraft carriers on the Japanese side in 5 minutes. And so this is really going to end Japanese expansion, but up till this point, Japan had really been dominating the Pacific. So, looking at this entire video or this section, what is the most important part of the notes in this section and why?